new currency based on the minerals, what we can do to the dollar. If we become a United States of Africa with our minerals alone, we can collapse the dollar. We can collapse the strong pound that is based on gold, yet they don't have a gold mine. So why do you allow such things?
Found a way to trade in local currencies, which would reduce their dependency on the US dollar. The Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, or COMSA, has launched a digital payment system. It would allow the 21 member nations of the regional economic bloc to settle cross-border payments in local currencies, eliminating the need to convert them into hard currencies like the American dollar for international trade.
How is US dollars part of the trade between Djibouti and... And we are saying that today, Afri-Exim Bank have given us a mechanism where traders in our continent can trade in their goods and services, and the Africa-Exim Bank will settle payments in local currency.
Countries officially announced they will stop using the U.S. dollar for trade. I mean, this could be just the beginning. Trump's relentless tariffs, sanctions, and reckless spending have weakened the dollar's strength. He may have once believed his policies would make America stronger, but now those very policies are pushing America out of the global financial spotlight. If the dollar loses its status as the global reserve currency, inflation will soar, prices will rise.
It starts quietly. No announcements, no press conferences, no warnings, just a series of small decisions: a currency swap here, a new trade agreement there, a payment made in something that is not the US dollar. But every tiny ripple adds up until suddenly the world realizes something massive is shifting beneath the surface. Across the African continent, governments, central banks, and business leaders are doing something that would have been unthinkable just a decade ago. They are walking away from the US dollar, not slowly, not cautiously, but deliberately, boldly, publicly, and the world's most powerful economies are starting to panic. Because this isn't just a financial move, it's a political statement, a generational shift, a quiet rebellion against a system that has controlled global trade for nearly 50 years. For decades, the dollar wasn't just a currency. It was the world's oxygen, energy, food, medicine, weapons, infrastructure, everything moved through the same pipeline. You wanted to buy oil? Dollars build ports? Dollars take loans? Dollars, even countries that didn't like the system still had to play by its rules. But now something is breaking. It began when African leaders realized a simple truth. A continent rich in energy, gold, minerals, and food should not be borrowing its own wealth back in someone else's money. It should not be begging for access to the very system built on its resources, and it should not be punished every time the dollar swings, crashes, or panics. So they began searching for alternatives. First came local currency deals, small at first, 2 African countries deciding to trade in their own money instead of dollars. Then a few more, then regional blocs joined in. Soon entire sectors, fuel, food, electronics, quietly shifted into multi-currency systems. No fanfare, no drama, just a slow, strategic withdrawal from dependence. Then came the digital revolution. African fintech systems, once dismissed as developing world innovation, suddenly became the model the world wanted. Mobile banking soared, cross-border payment systems bypassed traditional Western networks entirely. The continent built a financial ecosystem so flexible, so decentralized, so fast that no global bank could match it. And once that infrastructure existed, everything changed. For the first time, African nations could make large-scale trades without touching a single US dollar. And when that happened, a door opened, a door that had been locked for half a century. Countries began trading energy for minerals, minerals for technology, technology for grain. Some traded with digital currencies, others used baskets of commodities, some even swapped goods directly, bypassing the global financial system entirely. And those who had always benefited from the dollar's dominance realized the monopoly was slipping away. Behind closed doors, analysts called it the Great Unwinding, a slow erosion of dollar demand, a diffusion of financial power, a shift the world had not seen since the collapse of old empires. But on the streets of Africa's capital, cities, it felt like something else. Independence. For decades, the dollar dictated inflation. interest rates,
Tariffs,
debt
sanctions,
cycles,
and reckless
entire
spending
national budgets
have weakened
rose
the
and fell
dollar's
depending
strength.
on decisions made thousands of miles away. A single rate hike could throw millions into poverty. A single sanctions threat could crush an entire industry. Now, African nations were writing their own rules. Energy producers began pricing their oil in multiple currencies. Gold-rich regions started storing wealth in metals instead of paper. Mineral-heavy economies began using their resources as collateral, bypassing Western banks entirely. For the first time, the continent's value was not measured in dollars, it was measured in assets, leverage, and strategy, and this terrified global markets. Because if Africa, the world's youngest, fastest-growing region, exits the dollar system, the consequences are enormous. Demand for U.S. currency drops. Treasury bonds weaken. Debt becomes harder to fund. Inflation becomes harder to control. And the one advantage that has allowed the United States to dominate global finance for decades begins to fade. This isn't just an economic shift, it is the unraveling of a world order. But Africa isn't trying to destroy anything. It's trying to build a system that rewards production instead of dependency. A system where currency reflects value, not power. A system where trade strengthens nations instead of trapping them. The real shock isn't that the dollar is losing influence. The real shock is what Africa is gaining in return: control, leverage, and options. For the first time in modern history, the continent isn't asking for a seat at the table, it's building its own table. And the rest of the world is being forced to sit at that table, whether they like it or not. African currencies are stabilizing, regional alliances are strengthening, commodity-backed digital systems are emerging. Countries once divided by colonial borders are now creating unified economic zones that move faster than the institutions that once controlled them. But this story isn't over. The dollar still dominates, the system still stands, and the global transition won't be smooth. There will be backlash, pressure, warnings, incentives, new alliances, new tensions. Because when the world's most powerful currency starts losing influence, the world's most powerful institutions don't sit quietly. Still, momentum is building, and once momentum reaches a tipping point, the shift becomes irreversible. Today, Africa is no longer asking, should we move away from the dollar? It's asking, why did we wait so long? And the rest of the world is now asking a new question, a question that will define the next decade. If Africa stops using the US dollar, what happens next? The answer is coming, and when it arrives, it will shake the global financial system to its core. The shift didn't happen in a single moment, it happened in patterns that global analysts ignored until it was too late, because at first the signs looked harmless. A regional trade bloc announcing local currency settlements, a small country adopting digital payments for cross-border commerce, a few energy exporters accepting alternative currencies for test shipments, nothing that looked like a direct attack, nothing that suggested the foundations of the global monetary system were cracking. But beneath the surface, a storm was forming. Africa's financial awakening didn't begin with rebellion, it began with frustration. For years, nations across the continent watched their currencies rise and fall based on decisions made in foreign capitals. A minor shift in global interest rates could wipe out national budgets. A dip in the dollar could plunge millions into inflation. And foreign lenders, always positioned as partners, dictated spending, reforms, and policies that often created dependency instead of growth. So African leaders began asking a new question: what if stability didn't come from the outside, but from within? That question triggered a quiet revolution. The first big shift happened in trade. African exporters realized that if they kept trading in dollars, they were essentially paying a fee to participate in a system that wasn't built for them. So they started experimenting. A coffee exporter traded in regional currency. A telecom deal settled in digital tokens. A government purchased infrastructure using an alternative currency swap. The experiments worked, and soon they weren't experiments anymore, they became policy. This wasn't just about pride or independence, it was about survival, because relying on the dollar had a hidden cost: vulnerability. When the dollar rose in strength, African currencies collapsed. When sanctions hit other regions, Africa felt the shockwaves. When global banks tightened controls, essential imports stalled. The system created winners and losers, and Africa was rarely in the first category. So the continent started protecting itself. Regional banks built currency buffers. New clearing systems allowed countries to trade directly without routing payments through foreign institutions. Tech innovators created mobile platforms that moved money across borders in seconds, far faster than Western banks ever could. The most powerful shift came from something no one predicted: the rise of African resource alliances. Across the continent, countries realized they weren't weak, they were resource superpowers. They controlled the minerals that power electric vehicles, the metals that fuel batteries, the energy that runs industry. Oil, gas, cobalt, gold, lithium, manganese, the building blocks of the future economy were buried beneath African soil, so these nations made a groundbreaking decision. If resources are African, pricing should be too. Some countries linked resource prices to their own currencies, others formed alliances to negotiate better terms. A few took the boldest step of all. They began accepting payment in anything except dollars, digital currencies, commodity swaps, regional money, strategic credit lines. Suddenly, buyers had no choice but to adapt. That's when the world noticed, because once resource-rich nations stopped relying on the US dollar, the entire economic architecture began to wobble. Dollar demand weakened, sovereign reserves diversified, American debt markets felt pressure, and global investors, once certain of the dollar's eternal dominance, quietly shifted their portfolios. But Africa's transformation wasn't only economic, it was psychological. For decades, the continent had been treated as a passive player, a market to be shaped, a resource well to be tapped. But as financial independence grew, so did confidence. Suddenly, African negotiators weren't pleading for better terms, they were setting them. Not accepting conditions but rewriting them. Energy deals began using multi-currency baskets, infrastructure contracts were priced in local money. Development loans came from new global partners, not just the old institutions. And the more Africa diversified, the more leverage it gained. The shockwaves spread faster than anyone predicted. Trade routes shifted, manufacturing patterns changed, shipping chains recalibrated, and in global boardrooms, a realization took hold. The dollar-centric world was losing one of its most important pillars, the African market. But the transition wasn't smooth. Western institutions issued warnings, credit agencies downgraded countries that drifted toward alternative systems, analysts claimed the shift would create chaos, some governments faced diplomatic pressure to return to dollar-based policies, others were told their reforms threatened stability, but Africa didn't back down, because something had changed at the deepest level. A new generation was in charge and they weren't interested in preserving old hierarchies. Young economists, technologists, and policymakers saw the dollar dominance not as a safety net but as a ceiling. They weren't nostalgic about past alliances. They were ambitious about future possibilities. And to them, shifting away from the dollar wasn't defiance, it was evolution. The biggest breakthrough came when entire regions began preparing shared financial frameworks, shared payment systems, shared energy corridors, shared digital currencies. Industries that used to compete began cooperating. Nations that once depended on foreign intermediaries began conducting direct trade. The world suddenly faced a new reality. Africa wasn't fragmenting, it was integrating, and integrated markets don't need external currencies to function. Global observers were stunned. They had assumed Africa would always be financially dependent. But now, those same experts were asking new questions behind closed doors. What happens when the continent's population, the largest workforce on Earth, no longer measures its prosperity in dollars? What happens when its trade routes rewire toward new global centers? What happens when its resources no longer fund foreign power structures? The answer is simple. Everything changes. As the dollar's grip weakens, Africa's economic flexibility strengthens. Nations become less vulnerable to global shocks. Currencies stabilize, local industries grow. Foreign powers can no longer use financial pressure as leverage, and for the first time, Africa's bargaining power rises to match its potential. But this story has another layer. One the world is only beginning to understand. Africa isn't ditching the dollar alone, it's joining a global tide. Other regions across the world are making similar moves, driven by the same desire for autonomy, and Africa, with its resources and innovation, is becoming the center of this new movement. This is not the collapse of an old system, it is the birth of a new one, a system where financial power is distributed, not concentrated, where currencies compete instead of dominate, where nations trade based on value, not hierarchy, where the future is not dictated by the past. Africa didn't set out to challenge the dollar, Africa set out to control its destiny, and in doing so, it has shaken the foundation of global finance. The world is now watching the continent with a mix of fear, respect, and curiosity, because no one knows exactly what comes next, but everyone knows this: the shift cannot be reversed. A continent that controls its resources, its trade, its currency, and its alliances is a continent that controls its future, and Africa is stepping into that future boldly, strategically, and without hesitation.